Back with another video, and today's video is going to be looking at Wolves versus Leeds in the English Premier League, and it's going to be made using Keyframe. I'll also post a link to my blog below if you want to check out some more tactical content, and let's get right into it. So Leeds lined up in their typical 4-3-3, which often moved to a 4-4-2 in their high block to press Wolves using a 5-3-2, and some key movements in the match stemmed from the clash of formations between Wolves' 5-3-2 and the 4-3-3 of Leeds. So first picture here is Leeds defending and Adama Traore on the ball in the half space, with Wolves having narrow wingers typically occupying spaces in the half space, as well as Pedro Neto, and they were very versatile in that they were able to switch sides. And we can see here the narrow front three from Wolves, and from Leeds always maintaining numerical superiority in the back. So Strack is now the free player, creating a 2v1 versus the central striker from Wolves. We see now Stuart Dallas jumping to follow and track the run of Adama Traore, and Rafinha dropping deeper to control the forward progression of Nelson Semedo, and as well as Click and the other Leeds players now adjusting to the players around them while trying to maintain spatial control. So the further away from the ball their player is, the greater the distance the Leeds players will have to these players. So with the wingers from Wolves also playing more narrow, it also gives opportunity for the wide players, the wing backs from Wolves, to then progress further forward and take advantage of the low density wide areas. So now in the build-up phase, Wolves didn't use their goalkeeper very much in the build-up, and they built up sparingly with always their intention to progress the ball. And Leeds were able to press them via their makeshift two forwards in this phase of the game. They would press out to in, forcing the ball centrally, using their cover shadows to eliminate the options towards the center backs. But this gave Wolves a potential to use numerical superiority in the initial build-up phase. So with their central defender on the ball, and both Leeds players using their cover shadows, because in the past we've seen only one player, but because Leeds in their high block went with their two forwards, both forwards would use their cover shadow. It would create the interesting dynamics of the free players then being created through the center backs, as well as being able to use their central midfielders as more of pivots to then create third man actions to then access these players. So then we see here Wolves going long, as they did because of the Leeds press, and the man orientation of this. And then this made it very hard for then Wolves to even find their wide players, as we mentioned before, even via the third man option and third man actions in these areas. So with just keeping that in mind, we can look at how they respond going forward and preparing for the second ball. And when Wolves did play long, this suited Leeds because they had the numerical superiority in their deeper lines. And we see now how that was the case. So Strack was the free player with Cooper, but as we see now, they're matched 2v2. And this stemmed from the change of positioning of Luke Ayling. So when the ball went over Luke Ayling's head, then he knew that Strack was there to cover. So then this allowed the Leeds players to then prepare for the second ball, because the ball is most likely to then go into the areas in the direction in which it came. So then we see Leeds controlling all of the area around the second ball. So that's why it may have appeared to be that Leeds were using numerical equality in this instance, when in fact they were just preparing for the second action. And now for the Leeds buildup. We can take a look at a few wide rotations. So oftentimes Jamie Shackleton would then move into the wider areas, and this was very much a general concept of the Leeds midfield, moving into wider areas, moving into less dense areas, while the players in the defensive line were on the ball. They're not quite structured yet, as it's a transition phase, but we can see here the Leeds players in their back line, the Wolves front three, and now the start of the rotation with Jamie Shackleton moving into a wider area. And now we have more space created for the other Leeds players like Click, or our other central midfielders, or Rafinha coming in. So with Jamie Shackleton coming wider, often Rafinha would come in off the wing to occupy the half space, and then their rotations can then further start and progress from here. So as we see, Luke Ayling, after he passes, he overlaps Shackleton, who then makes a narrow run, and with Rafinha running through the half space, this triggers the advanced midfielder, Tyler Roberts, to then check back towards the ball to the vacated space. So an action from Leeds is one, moving players away from the ball to then access the vacated area and take advantage of the space created by manipulating defenders. So just as what I've highlighted here, the space being created, and we can always mention the weak side players, weak side midfielders, trying to pin inactive defenders from Wolves to try and create these dynamic advantages to then further progress the ball. Wolves played very well, however, and their use of a 5-2-3 when pressing was very effective against the Leeds build-up, and we can see the front three from here. And the interesting part about it was oftentimes Leeds couldn't gain numerical superiority through the midfield because of the use of the weak side winger. For Wolves, when he wasn't pressing, he would maintain a deeper and more narrow position to create access to the weak side holding midfielder, or just the weak side midfielder, as well as staying connected to the press to then be able to press a wide central defender. So here we have it, our front three, use of the cover shadow to then force the play to one side. So rather than Stuart Dallas being free as the left back, he's blocked by the cover shadow, which forces play to one side. Adama Traore playing slightly deeper, as we mentioned, but also maintaining access to the fullback as well as more central players, while the forward holds his position, doesn't leave too early, because if he goes out to press too early, we can see what will happen. If he goes out to press, the space will then be in the pivot area for Leeds to take advantage of his, and then that's when they're quite dangerous, when you fall into the trap of vacating the space that Leeds want you to. But with the press from Wolves, they did very well. And here we see the same concept from Neto now on the weak side. So just accessing both players as well as the double pivot. We can see they're quite overextended here, but when pressing the high block, this will happen. So we can see that across the field, they match up using numerical equality by isolating the field and preventing access to the weak side, which then allows them to press Leeds in tight areas into central areas, and then allows for a faster transition. And when we see Leeds in possession, it creates the potential for Wolves to transition into a situation of numerical equality and even numerical superiority when they win the ball to attack the central players holding, covering the Leeds in possession. So now we see where they win the ball. As we mentioned, in the pivot area, Neto wins the ball, pinching in from the weak side through his use of dual roles, and then this allows the attacking players to start making moves in behind and further up the field for Wolves to then try and create a situation going forward before Leeds players can then regain their shape and regain cover, as we just highlight the overextended spaces and the huge amounts of space through the middle that were vacated. So now, once again, here's a situation of when Leeds were able to advance the ball via building from the back. Their use of the four-man back line with deep fullbacks to try and pull out the wingbacks from Wolves, and then the use of the asymmetric midfield. The weak side attacking player Click isn't in the screen at the moment, but he's higher, creating the asymmetry, but also a little bit narrow as well. And then we can also see the front three from Wolves, as we mentioned. When the ball's with the central defender, the center forward is the player who has dual roles and required to create access to both center backs, so the wingers can then just maintain their connection narrow and focus on pressing the fullbacks. So with this happening, it looks like the fullbacks will be free, when in reality the Wolves players are ready to press them. So now the last picture is showing when Leeds can progress and showing the importance of the pressing from Wolves. When they used Melier as a back three to build up out of, we had Luke Ayling as almost as a free player when Adama Traore would go and press, but when the Wolves front three weren't working in complete unison, there were gaps that were almost exploited on a few occasions. So when Adama Traore would go and press, that would force the wingback into his vertical partnership role. So Adama Traore presses, now our wingback is arriving late, and Luke Ayling's first touch, as we mentioned before, will be narrow, and as we see Jamie Shackleton as the pivot. So when Luke Ayling takes his first touch more narrow, it can then allow him to use the 2v1 that he'll create by taking the defender who's jumping late out of the picture by taking his touch narrow, and then Jamie Shackleton will take his defender away through his movement, so to counteract the touch of Luke Ayling. And now we can see that Luke Ayling is able to then play the weak side pass because of the subtle movement that didn't occur with Pedro Neto. Usually Pedro Neto would be slightly more narrow and deeper to prevent this, so the only pass that would have been available was a deeper horizontal pass, but because Pedro Neto wasn't connected to the press, that this ball was able to then be played. So here is just a tendency for the Leeds players. When Luke Ayling receives the ball, he receives it more narrow. So when players like Adama Traore are pressing from out to in using their cover shadows to block the wide passing options, the ability for Luke Ayling to then take his first touch into the half space gives him a closer connection to the players around him, and it's able to create these structures and give him stronger connections to the players in more dangerous areas. So not only this, but it also can give him the dynamic superiority that he needs to progress the ball, and with players' movement, it also creates more diagonal passing options through Rafinha, Shackleton, and then now Click coming over from the weak side. So the initial touch to take him more narrow is actually advantageous for him because it puts him closer to his passing options, as well as the front three from Wolves is now broken. So now they'll defend and try and drop into a lower block. So here again, one last rotation from Leeds using a back four. In possession of the ball, we see the two midfielders on the screen at the moment. And usually the player who is closer to the ball, the central midfielder, many times he can go wider to then pull out the Wolves defenders from the center to then create space via his horizontal movement, or he can threaten in behind to then pull defenders away from him and create more space between the lines using vertical movement. And now, just highlighting the Wolves shape quickly, their compactness, their use of the 5-2-3, their pressing players preventing Leeds from circulating possession, as well as we see just a jumping center back to control this movement between the lines by click, and then we'll see how Leeds use this movement to then progress. So here's another picture with a similar concept, but it shows all three midfielders, so I wanted to show this clip before we move on into the next picture. So with our three midfielders and now an asymmetric back four, using deep fullbacks almost creates like a back three, and this puts our winger in a wider area, maintaining the width. So now what we'll see is players using vertical movements, runs in behind when the ball goes into the wide winger or the wide center back. So the run in behind will then separate the lines of Wolves. They'll separate the lines of Wolves vertically to then create more space between them so that Leeds can access these advanced areas and progress the ball.